Well, good morning. Well, today's adult forum is with Shereka Banton, and you guys are in for a treat. I had this wonderful conversation with Shereka yesterday. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah. Of course.
And we're gonna kick it off with, there's so many topics that we wanna talk about, but we're gonna address some of the things that is actually really current. But before we get into all of those details, I'd love to hear from Shereka, your upbringing. Like,
Sure.
Who are you? Where are you from? What is your background?
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks for having me today. I'm really excited to share my story with our congregation. So I was born in Jamaica in the Caribbean. My family immigrated to the U.S. when I was 4 years old. To the state of Georgia, just outside the Atlanta suburbs. And so being a part of an immigrant family coming to the US, I immediately knew that there was going to be a transition. And so my sisters and I, even from a speaking and language perspective, we learned very quickly, especially in the American South, to switch our accent. So I can switch between the Jamaican dialect and how I'm speaking right now, right? It was very much a part of our upbringing to recognize that, we had a very distinct Jamaican heritage, but we were also very much integrating into the American culture, which is wonderful and awesome. So I grew up in the Atlanta suburbs. One of the more seminal kind of aspects of my faith journey was when my mom started having us attend Charles Stanley's church in Atlanta. So Charles Stanley was a Southern Baptist preacher, mega church, over the course of his ministry. And it was really at that moment, I think I was about 7 or 8 years old when we started attending Charles Stanley's church. That became such a fundamental part of my growth, my journey, being involved and exposed to what was a very multicultural church and kind of taboo for Atlanta in the early 90s. And just really that propelled me, I think, to see my faith as something to be integrated in my life. That has continued to this day. So growing up in the Atlanta suburbs, went to Georgia Tech for engineering, undergrad and PhD. During my PhD, we might get into this a little later, I had to move to New York City to finish my dissertation research for plethora of reasons. So you can imagine me coming from the islands and the southern United States and seeing George Washington Bridge. My heart dropped when I saw it as we were driving across. So I spent 2.5 years in New York City. Thought I was headed back south, and actually Johnson & Johnson, or J&J, hired me in 2017. So I've now lived in the Northeast in New Jersey after that point for about 8 years. And here I am.
Wow. So your faith journey has been, I think, from your family, what I gather, and Southern Baptist tradition to New York City, and I'm sure you had some kind of faith community there.
Yes.
And I also know that you are part of a non-denominational church.
Yes.
And then now here we are in Episcopal Church.
Yes.
So what was that faith journey like?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I feel like I've been exposed to so many different denominations through my journey. And, Southern Baptist, if, folks aren't aware, I'm sure folks are, it's very conservative, very much tied to a specific lifestyle that I want to say I adopted and prescribed to in quite a few ways that I've carried into adulthood. As I moved through my 20s and today, going to non-denominational church here in New Jersey and now at All Saints, I think what stuck out to me is that, beyond the liturgy and the teaching at the individual churches, I've been blessed to be a part of congregations where diversity is valued. And so what I mean by that is, if I go back to my start at First Baptist Church in Atlanta with Charles Stanley, he was one of the first pastors in Atlanta to integrate his church, to have people of color in leadership positions. That was very taboo even in the early 90s. So to have had that ingrained in me, to see faith communities as places where we can all show up as we are and coexist and love each other, learn about Jesus and the gospel and that was awesome. And so the non-denominational church here in Princeton that I attended, similar. Now at All Saints, very much similar, where we have what I think is just an awesome mesh of backgrounds and experiences and perspectives and different professional journeys that I think has really made me see like denominations as, yes, there are those, I'm going to say, more academic and intellectual differences, but I think in terms of having very rich communities of people where everyone can feel welcome and belong, like I think that's been just fantastic. And I think All Saints has grown to the top of my list now that, and maybe it's recency bias, but it's grown to the top of my list in a lot of ways because of how we really dig into the individual person and their perspectives and how that weaves into their faith journey. So it's just been wonderful.
It's fascinating to hear from you that you not only saw that diversity within the community, but you saw the leadership of the community making very intentional decision to include diversity.
That's right.
Right? And then that was very formative for you because you were very young, right?
Yeah.
Teenage years, in Atlanta?
Yeah.
Okay. And I'm sure that has some effect on your professional life as well. So let's talk about your work.
Sure.
I know you have PhD in some kind of science. Tell us more about that.
Sure. So I studied biomedical engineering at Georgia Tech for my bachelor's and PhD. So my PhD research was actually around sickle cell disease. So I worked in a vascular engineering and tissue regeneration lab. You don't have to remember that, but essentially we were looking at, in my space, essentially how blood flows through our bodies and the different vessels that they flow through. And in sickle cell disease, if you're knowledgeable about that particular disorder, people's blood cells are actually crescent moon shaped. And so what happens is in the smaller vessels, the micro-sized vessels, those sickle-shaped or crescent moon blood cells actually get stuck. They bunch up on each other, they cluster. So you can imagine there's a lot of pain, there's blockage of blood flow, there's loss of oxygen in that local tissue area. And in a lot of cases, there's even necrosis in the deeper tissues. And in the neurological tissue, we even have folks who present with strokes. So you can imagine children, pediatric patients presenting with strokes because of this sickling of the red blood cells. So it's it's a very debilitating disorder. I think the life expectancy for folks with sickle cell anemia is still to this day only about 40, right? Which is vastly different than many other disorders or even what the average life expectancy is. So my research was geared or focused on understanding what's happening in those small blood vessels, those microns blood vessels, and we would model and come up with like what we call microfluidic systems and engineer synthetic vessels so that we could study how those red blood cells were interacting on the benchtop. So it was extremely valuable work. I think research and scientific research, number one, it teaches you perseverance because experiments fail. There are a lot of questions and uncertainties. The human body is extremely complex. So to try to fuse the science of the body, medicine, plus engineering, fluid mechanics, all those principles in one, it definitely grew me over the 10 years that I was doing that research and working in that space. And I would also say, why I was drawn to biomedical research specifically was because of that human and patient connection, that ability to trace my work back to actual people. So I had the opportunity to partner with physicians at the Medical College of Georgia. I had 2 physicians on my dissertation committee who treated sickle cell patients in their day-to-day. So I got that human perspective, got that human element of my work, which just made it all come full circle for me during those years.
Oh, that's amazing. I know you guys all got that. Well, we'll do a little pop quiz at the end. So with that academic background and with your research, what are you doing now?
Yeah, sure. So after I worked in the lab for about 10 years, we have a lot of academics in the crowd. I think most know that for folks who do PhDs, the more traditional path is to become a tenure track research professor. I knew that wasn't going to be my path because I always was quite interested in public policy and regulations, particularly how that shapes how we do science, who does science, how the outcomes and products of scientific research get to patients and to the people who need them. And so during grad school, I also carved out time to step into the science policy arena. I interned in Washington at the National Science Foundation, got to know the science policy community. And so I knew even as I was finishing up my research that I would move into a field that brought me into science policy or science policy adjacent topics. So the plan after I graduated was to head back to Washington. I had the connections there. But I graduated in 2017, and that was when Donald Trump began his first term. And one of the things, or the first things he did was enact a government-wide hiring freeze. So the plans that I had, and now maybe God had other plans for me, so the plans that I thought that were going to be for me turned into me having to pivot away from federal service and pivot towards industry. So that's how I found regulatory affairs, or God led me to regulatory affairs, where now in the company that I work, or the companies that I've worked in the role, I'm responsible for essentially making sure that our products are compliant, making sure that our products do meet the regulations for medical device and pharma here in the US and globally, because we do sell globally. So I still get to, touch on the actual regulations, and I also still get to see the science of the products as they're being designed and manufactured.
Wow, fascinating. So regulatory affairs is this very interesting space between science and law, and I get really excited about that. But when you go into your work every day, and there's many decisions that you are helping to be made. And perhaps there are decisions that you have to make towards that larger decision. I could imagine the kind of weight of those kind of tasks ahead of you. I mean, even for me, if I think that everything that is involved in my client's case is really up to me, I don't know if I can get out of my bed every morning.
Right.
That'll be very much crushing. So what is your perspective every day when you get up and go into this regulatory affairs work?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And just to contextualize Haejin's question more, I view it as a privilege to work at J&J, where we are supplying products globally to over 70 countries on a daily basis. We're shipping millions of units per day, right? So the decisions that I'm making truly impact our global public health, or has global public health implications, such that if these products aren't available, doctors call us, hospitals call us, they call FDA to see where are the products that they need to perform. So we sell surgical products to perform virtually every type of surgery you could think of. And so I start my days, putting on the Ephesians 6 armor. In preparing for this interview, I reflected quite a bit on the story of Daniel, and his interactions with, I'm going to call them his coworkers when he was in Babylon, and how they, schemed against him and so on, right? Because I think that just from a reality perspective, we're in this crazy world where there are different motivations, and for some it's revenue and sales, for others it's the true global public health, patient impact, human connection, right? And so every day we have to kind of contend with that, or I have to contend with that. And I think what's unique about J&J is that we have what's called our credo, and the very first sentence for the company mission is that we have a commitment to our patients. And that is something we live into. So, every decision is not necessarily made about how does that impact the bottom dollar. It's about what is the impact on that patient. And so we've had, and I won't get into details, but we've had many scenarios where we made calls on the products that we support, the activities we're doing, because we knew that it meant that person on the other side of us was getting that product, even if it came at a loss to the company, right? So I think that it's a long way to answer your question, but I think it's very much constant tension between what I know to be the God way of proceeding and deciding and making those types of decisions, and then on the other side of that, it's very much contending with, I'm going to say, the greater spiritual forces that are out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Christians are called to be a priest, right, king, and prophet. And even in this regulatory affairs work, I think I see the kind of all three of them, but especially the priestly calling of caring for people. Although you feel like you are behind a desk, you're far away from those patients all over the globe. What are the kind of challenges or brokenness that you see in your industry right now? And we are also called to see beyond or even see through those fractures and find beauty. So if you can tell us about that.
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. I'm sure everyone is following the news right now and seeing what's happening, particularly here in the US from a political perspective, right? And I would love to say that what I do is agnostic and immune to what's happening in the political landscape, but it's not, right? And it's the same in other countries, right? In Europe, we saw similar things impacting the pharma and medical device industry about 10 years ago. It's kind of sweeping through the US right now. So one of the challenges, and I'll just be completely transparent, I know this is going on YouTube, but that's okay, is this tension between what's happening from a broader political sense and then us as regulatory affairs professionals staying true to the bread and butter of what we do, right? So my commitment and obligation is to make sure that every product that exits my company is safe and effective and is going to perform as intended, right? So now if we have politics and other types of issues seeping in, it's a question of how disruptive will that be to my day-to-day? Is it going to slow down my ability to evaluate? Is it going to slow down our relationship and interactions with the regulators in the government agencies to get that product to that patient, to make sure it's safe and effective? I think that's one of our biggest challenges today, is the unknown around how much of my day-to-day work is going to be impacted by the new policies and procedures, or even the folks who are being installed. How much of my day-to-day is going to be affected, which then impacts the ability to get product to patient.
In your work now, I know it feels heavy, but yet there's this gospel hope, in your work. So what do you think God has provided for you to go through this time of challenge, to stay faithful to your calling? And if there's any specific prayer requests that we can cover you with by this community, please share.
Sure. So, I think God has really blessed me with community outside of work, and then I would say even community within work, or within that work environment. And I think it's very important to, emphasize that I'm not working on an island by any stretch, right? We work on teams, we work with other people. And so it's very important, and what God has blessed me with is surrounding me with people who see the vision, who see the mission, who understand that ultimately we're not to capitulate to, individual preferences or thoughts or, agendas. We need to make sure that we get the right product to the right patient. We need to make sure that our products are safe and effective. And so I think that kind of, I call it like an interfaith community at work, and then we have my faith community outside of work, has really been such a blessing in terms of being able to handle the challenges and handle them in a way that is graceful, that is kind, that is not like dramatic and over the top, which can sometimes happen in these types of environments. And so, my prayer request is just for that clarity, that ability to just kind of weather whatever may be coming to this particular industry, this particular line of work, right? Just so that we can, of course, make sure that people have the treatments and the medical technologies that they need.
If you were to give any advice to a young person who might be thinking about regulatory affairs, or even misunderstand that industry and not consider regulatory affairs, what would be your advice?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the misunderstanding about regulatory, and even I had it when I was entering, is I didn't understand the true impact of what we do. I didn't recognize that, in these 1,000-page documents and folios that we're submitting, that could be the difference. If one paragraph could be the difference in a product being made available to a specific country or a specific hospital. That's very intense work, which you probably relate to from a legal perspective. And so I would tell an aspiring regulatory person or a student to really recognize the magnitude of the work, get that technical and scientific foundational training, and then also just be ready to navigate and be comfortable with uncertainty and unpredictability, since it's a field that is so impacted by whatever political climate happens to be evolving at that time. As I mentioned before, in Europe, about 10 years ago, there was quite a bit of political fodder that was impacting all major industries. In the US, we're seeing it now. We'll probably see it in other places. So really being able to navigate uncertainty, be comfortable with it, and if they're a person of faith, just leaning on God and trusting in His direction.
When I see you, Shereka, I see, and hearing your story and getting to know you better, I see this really courageous, beautiful warrior. But warrior who's fighting not for his or her own sake or life, but for the sake of others. Where do you think that courage comes from in your life?
Yeah, so I would say my mom. So my mom is an emergency room nurse and has been such, retiring soon, been an emergency room nurse for about 40 plus years. She was on the front lines of COVID. She never missed a day. She didn't back down from what was, in front of her. And I'll never forget when I started working in industry and I said, these are the products I'm responsible for. And she said, I use those in my hospital, right? So that made it come full circle for me to understand the importance of my work, not in some, kind of abstract way, but I had a very direct and personal example of how what I was doing every day impacted someone in the field with patients in a hospital. And I think that seeing her courage, hearing the wide range of cases and patients she's had over her career, and yet her constant commitment to showing up, being there, having that bedside, kindness and grace and love for her patients has really instilled in me the importance of, while I'm upstream of the actual care environment, really making sure that the products that we're sending out will perform as they need to and help those patients and healthcare professionals like my mom.
That's amazing. I know you also lead the Women's Bible Study for All Saints, and thank you for doing that. And then you also serve on the vestry. And you did mention that you reflected on the book of Daniel to prepare for this interview today. What has been your kind of most recent faith journey or your reflection on Daniel, and especially as you face the challenges of the day?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I won't go into too many details, but as I alluded to earlier, we're very much contending with tensions between stockholder commitments, shareholder commitments, the need to supply product to wherever it needs to go. And as you can imagine in businesses, sometimes, that leads to behaviors that toe the line of what is acceptable depending on your perspective and worldview. And so I've had to be a Daniel in some cases, and really kind of recognize that there could be professional costs to speaking up and showing that there needs to be integrity in certain situations. But I think that it's absolutely necessary. particularly in this line of work, as I was saying, where some of these situations could be life or death depending on the state of that product that's exiting our company or exiting any company. And so I'm very thankful that I have biblical examples and biblical references, praise God, right, to lead me and help me manage and navigate situations like that. In our prep, I jokingly told her that there were days I would be driving into the office and listening to sermons on David and Goliath and getting my warrior mindset going, right? Because, sometimes they can be very tense, some of these conversations and situations where there's a ton of money on the line and people feel like their careers, aspirations, and their life's dreams are on the line with some of these decisions. But, I think that, and I know that there's a bigger picture, right? I know where we're all going from a biblical and scriptural perspective, so I don't necessarily prescribe to that view. So, I've had to kind of put my foot down in a few situations.
Oh, thank you for doing that. Thank you so
course.
much. Yeah. Well, I'd like to open this time up to questions from the audience. So I'll go for Reed, Doti, and Ellen.
So first, I'd like to thank you for doing this forum. It's so interesting to hear your background and your story. And I think All Saints is really blessed that you're part of the community, and not only being part of the community, but you've stepped into leadership, as we mentioned, with the vestry and with the Bible group, and then I know you've organized these theater
Yes.
outings as well. And so I'm really interested because this is it's a great testimony to the church that you chose, because you could have chosen any church to join, and that you ended up at All Saints.
Yeah.
So I'm really interested. What was your process to actually, choose, or how did you find All Saints? Because I know we have worked in the past about trying to include. How do we get?
Right.
All of us, a number of us, think that this is such a great church, but how do you get the word out? And so it's interesting to hear how you made that connection.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you, Reed. So my transition to All Saints came in the height of the pandemic. And so I was going to another church here in Princeton, and it was going through its motions as well, as I think many churches were going through during the pandemic and during all of the protests and so on that erupted in that 2020, 2021 timeframe. And so I knew I was looking for something new. And I think Father Hugh Brown was still rector at that time. I started to stream on Sunday. I started to like what I was hearing in terms of his teaching, but also a very clear position outward into the community, which resonates with me in terms of how engaged is a congregation or a church with its actual local community, right? It's also how I looked at universities when I was going to graduate school. Was I going to be in the lab for 6 or 7 years and never know anything going on in my local community, or would I have or be in an environment where it was okay or not frowned upon to have engagement with the outside? And so with All Saints, I saw that the teaching, check. There was an outward focus on community and outreach, check. And then once I visited, I remember we had the summer kind of fellowship after 10:15 service just outside in the courtyard. And I remember the very first Sunday that I visited, 2 people immediately said, "What's your name? What's your story?" I came back the next week. They remembered my name. They remembered my story. And so that was just an immediate connection. And I knew that there's something special about this particular congregation, right? I've been in the mega church environment. I've been in the smaller, but larger than All Saints non-denominational environment. And I knew that this was going to be good for me to have that community, have more intimate connections with people where people remember your name. And that there was something that I could come and, be a part of. And it's been a treat to, join in, participate. Shameless plug, we are going to see Screw Tape Letters on April 6th, so please sign up. But it's just been really great to be in the community. Like I said, that's just so rich in terms of the backgrounds and interests and experiences. And, I'm very prayerful that God is going to grow the congregation. He has his way of really breathing life into spaces.
Oh, that's wonderful. And I think, if I may, there's one story that actually Shereka mentioned to me, like when I first met her, how she was just blown away by the fact that we had, different people who are participating in the service. And, she saw Olga actually giving a special praise and performing during the service. And she has never seen kind of love and just beauty surrounding that. So I thought that was really impactful for me to also hear.
So I told Haejin in our prep, everyone knows that I'm a Christian at work. I don't wear a label on my forehead, but everyone knows that, Wednesdays at 4:30 I have Bible study. So I don't come to the office on Wednesdays because I need to be at home and ready for Bible study. Everyone knows that I'm in my vestry. They know that I go to church every Sunday. It's not something that I hide. And with that said, it's not a way that I exclude or, how can I say, try to divide people at work, right? It's just something that's very much a part of my person, and I ask them to respect that about me, and I respect whatever their, worldview and experiences are as well. And so I think that in terms of my witness, it's more so just letting God flow, letting the Spirit flow through me and interact and be whatever bridge He wants me to be and whatever light He wants me to be in that environment. But yes, it is known. It is no secret.
Thank you. Ellen and John.
A couple of related questions.
Sure.
What federal agency? I assume it's the FDA.
It's FDA. Yes.
Does J&J, do they have an objective of overachieving the FDA requirements, or is it sort of they just want to keep?
It's a great question.
Less is more.
Yeah.
Or more is more.
It's a great question, and because I work so close to the products and from an R&D perspective in manufacturing, I can answer it pretty well. So the understanding across the industry is that J&J always overshoots the requirements, sometimes doing way more than we need to, but it's because of the imperative that not only do we want to be market leaders, but we want to say our product is best or our product is performing better than others from places of safety, efficacy. And so to do that, you have to overshoot sometimes. The FDA's regulations you can view as baseline. And I don't want to suggest that FDA's baseline regulations aren't, on the up and up too, in terms of the level that they're requiring manufacturers to be at. It's just from a competitive advantage perspective, to be able to then say, we meet the high bar set by FDA and plus we can do X, Y, Z too. That's what we achieve or shoot for.
And it
does. In my day-to-day, it's very difficult to see political interventions playing out. I think, though, where we have concerns, and this is with any administration, it's not just what we're seeing now, where we have concerns is, will the new administration or any administration start to enforce policies or procedures that get in the way of the day-to-day to keep that bar high? So I don't see any administration coming in, knock on wood, and lowering the bar. What I see an administration coming in and doing is putting all kinds of loopholes and hurdles up that just slow down the process. So if you're, watching the news and you hear folks saying our innovation is going to be slowed down, approvals are going to be slower, we're going to fall behind other countries, it's because often when we have political interventions, it just slows things down, adds all these layers of complexity that don't have anything to do with the actual products or the medicines and technologies being developed. Because who's going to be reviewing all of the documentation that our companies are submitting? So that's the concern, right? While other countries may be investing in their health agencies and who works at them to speed up the rate of innovation.
Does FDA work? Tell me it doesn't work for Kennedy potentially?
It could. So he will be confirmed I think if it continues in the process, he'll be confirmed as the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services, which FDA reports into. So last year I had the awesome opportunity to visit the company's office in Tokyo. We are currently working on launching one of our products in Japan. There is patient need. There is a appetite for it, and so I was meeting with the local Japanese team, who's our, I'll say, the company's facing team to the local authority PMDA there. But I work very closely with them to make sure the strategies are in place to meet PMDA's requirements, which are very similar to US requirements, but there are certain, more specific areas of scrutiny. So my role is not only US focused, it's also global in terms of understanding the requirements across different countries and interacting with my colleagues who are in those countries as well.
John?
It's a great question, and it's one of those things where I think before I answer, and I'm not deflecting, I mean this sincerely, we have to make sure we understand definitions, right? Because oftentimes when people hear government regulations, they're thinking of the more higher level things that are very enforcement based, where if you don't do X, you're penalized by Y. Beyond that, there are many other procedures and policies that aren't actually codified into US law that is often more, I'll say, flexible to what is the actual process. So let me give you a more practical example of that. So for FDA receives from Congress different legislations that Congress has passed, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and they've made multiple revisions to it over the years. Most times it gives FDA maybe a paragraph, and that is what is codified into US law. From there, FDA then has to actually do the policy making work and actually set up the procedure and policy that governs whatever they were kind of told by Congress to do. And so do I think, to answer your question, do I think that it's too little, too much, or pretty good? I actually think it's pretty good, because the way that our system is set up is that it gives our agencies the opportunity to augment policies as is needed in the case of FDA to work in the interest of public health. So when I say I'm concerned around administrations coming in and creating a lot of noise, it's because those policies and procedures are where we can have a lot of just chaos, because now you're going to get into lots of conversations on what are the legalities of the connections of that policy to that subclause of that law that was codified. And I think it's a great system. I just think that you have to make sure the actual experts are the ones enacting the policies and procedures, or you have chaos. Yes.
Do you have to run the gauntlet with all the countries' FDAs in the world?
Yes, I do. So everywhere we sell product, we have to interact.
Where is the US on that spectrum? Who's tougher?
So it depends on the type of product. I've noticed for medical devices, the US and EU, European Union, are pretty strict. Japan, China would be the next tier, and depending on the type of device, you may have some flex around that. Most smaller countries actually adopt whatever the US and European Union do, because it's just, we're more mature in our systems, we're more mature in our regulations, so it just makes sense to do. But I know for pharmaceuticals, where pharmaceutical regulations are much more advanced and mature than medical devices, I would say the US, European Union, Japan, China are probably all at the same tier in terms of the level of requirements and scrutiny that companies have to go through.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah. Well, I'm going to actually pause here, and then you guys can continue to ask questions to Shereka. I know some of you have to go prepare for the worship. But before we end, I want to do something different and special today. When I see Shereka, we always live in a world that is struggling because of the fallen nature of our humanity. And we have different type of struggles. And how do we find hope in that kind of situation? And I think that we are looking at that hope. The very fact that God has given such conviction and courage and faith to Shereka, and expertise and brilliance to be in this space. And it could be very easy for her to be on different area where she doesn't have to face kind of struggles that she has to face every single day. So with that, I'm really grateful. And I would love for us to pray for her, knowing what we heard today.
Than what you know.
Yeah, I think so. And I think given just the level of unpredictability that can just come into this space, you know, when you're supplying products to patients across 70 countries, 100 countries in some cases, you have to be open to not knowing everything. It's not possible. And so I think built into our teams and how we work is the ability to move very quickly and react very quickly if the unpredictable becomes something that is reality. And I like it. It's not for everyone, right? You know, there's some times where I'm on 2 a.m. calls because somebody on the other side of the world has an issue, right? But it's the nature of the beast, I'll say, in terms of it's what we have to do to get this, from my perspective, get that product to that patient. And so, you know, when you think about career directions, it might not be for everyone, but, you know, I think it's very much, you know, understood that it comes with the territory of working in this space.
And I have found it's so interesting that in any marketplace, the excellent companies, excellent professionals, they exhibit a lot of the characteristics of that Christianity holds,
right.
like living in mystery, right? And having the courage in the face, and then having the integrity and all of that. That is more than just more than just like moral values, but being able to live in this exilic world with that kind of sense of mystery. So.
Well, thank you, Shereka.